Hello everyone, and thanks once again for joining us now for this Wednesday's edition of Alaska Weather, 13th day of October 2022, midway into the month now. And up first, we'll see a graphic here showing some pretty respectable rainfall amounts over the last 24 hours over the eastern North Gulf Coast and northern Panhandle areas. Dry Bay there, southeast of Yakutat, had just under 4 inches in a 24-hour period ending at 3 p.m. this afternoon. And down the coast, though, or as you head south, rainfall amounts became lighter. Lituya Bay down the coast there from Dry Bay had 2.5 inches of precipitation. And that same thing over the inside waters there, or inland a little bit. Haines seen 3.7 inches in the last 24 hours. And then you go down south to Juneau, and about 1 2/3 inches falling there. And rain fell all the way down to the southern areas, but much lighter and generally under an inch. And from there, as a result of the heavy rains that have been going on there, the flood watch continues there for the eastern North Gulf Coast and the northern Panhandle, and that's extended out through late Friday night at this point for possible flooding due to the recent heavy rains that have gone on there. And otherwise, there are no other watches, advisories, or warnings out anywhere around the state. Bering Sea looking good, Aleutians, Pribilofs, all the way up into the Bering Strait area. And even up north, no advisory watches or warnings out either for the next couple of days. And the Arctic coast, conditions improving up there gradually. And moving on to satellite imagery, you can still see a big low pressure area that's up over the Arctic, and then the counterclockwise flow pretty westerlies and bringing some areas of clouds and light snow in across the North Slope and Arctic coast. Winds much lighter today up in that area, and snowfall amounts. Central Arctic coast, I think, picked up 1 inch of snow in the last 24 hours, but other areas seeing less. Some areas could see a little more, especially on the North Slope there up toward the Berks Range, but not a lot of reports coming out of there. And then over the interior, variable clouds along the Yukon River there, and then the snow over the eastern interior. As much as 8 to 12 inches of snow fell over the Copper River Basin in the last 24 hours, and anywhere from 3 to 6 inches north of the Alaska Range, say Northway, and then about 1 inch at Eagle. All that shifting off to the east and diminishing slowly. Hasn't ended yet, but definitely a lot lighter snow in the Copper River Basin than there was. And heavy rains over the Panhandle, that frontal boundary, cold front out of the Yukon there, brought the heavier rains into the Panhandle, and then more of a south flow of moisture, southwest flow, you can see coming northeastward there, bringing the rain into the southern southeast coast, and then out over the Bering Sea, or actually out over the southern Bering Sea. A front brought gusty winds and some rain, pretty localized area of heavy rain, mostly over the eastern Aleutians. Other areas had light amounts, just a few hundredths of an inch over the Pribilofs, but there were some pretty gusty winds going on with that system. On the chart there, you can see a fairly tight gradient across the Alaska Peninsula. Before the front passed Nikolsky, they had peak wind gusts of 60 miles per hour, and the Pribilof seen pretty gusty winds as well. St. George Island had 56 mile an hour peak wind gust, and Unalaska had 51 miles per hour, and St. Paul 48 miles an hour. The Alaska Peninsula has seen some lighter winds, although they're on the upswing here this afternoon with the front approaching. Cold Bay, 41 mile an hour wind gusts there. And then swing the winds around to the north, 25 gusts, maybe as high as 50 miles an hour out of the western Aleutians, north to northeast winds there with periods of rain wet across much of the southern Bering Sea and the Aleutians with that system. Then the heavy rains over the northern Panhandle, that cold front associated with that 995 millibar low there up over the Northwest Territories. And then warm front type rain spreading into the southern southeast coast with that flow of moisture coming northeastward there over the coming up on the western side of that persistent ridge there off the west coast, off the Washington coast. And then light snow starting to pull back to the north a little bit there over the Arctic coast and North Slope areas. A lot of clearing skies today over south central Alaska. Temperatures dropping into the teens across much of south central Alaska into the Kenai Peninsula, and pretty chilly overnight lows, single numbers up along the Brooks Range and locally into the northern valleys there. But a lot of afternoon sunshine bringing temperatures up. Variable clouds, Kodiak Island. And for tonight, clouds will tend to increase across Kodiak to a certain extent, but it'll stay dry and winds on the light side. Rain will advance northeastward up the Alaska Peninsula and into the southern Aleutian Range, possibly as far north as Pilot Point, and Cape Newnam could see a chance of rain toward morning with a pickup in the wind. Stays windy and wet for the Pribilofs, windy and wet for the Alaska Peninsula and the central Aleutians. That low kind of dropping southward a little bit there, south of Nikolsky. Otherwise, drying out over the Panhandle with clearing over the northern areas late tonight. Might be a little fast with that, but it could happen. Anyway, definitely precipitation will be diminishing with just showers late tonight over the eastern border area. But moisture coming up still to the northeast there will likely spread another round of light rain and fog, not so much tonight into the southern Panhandle, but more likely tomorrow. And clear and cold over much of interior Alaska tonight. Temperatures definitely well below freezing, some areas dropping to near or slightly below zero in some areas. And less snow, just a few skiffs of snow now along the Arctic coast there with just breezy conditions at best, maybe 10 to 20 miles an hour in the westerly winds. Some exposed areas could see a little bit more, but nothing very significant at all, with light precipitation amounts, mostly call it flurries there with some possible fog, and dry over the northern Bering Sea. And then for tomorrow, that front elongates eastward there with high pressure over interior Alaska in the Northwest Territories, cold high pressure, and be mostly clear with light winds. Winds will start to pick up, though, over Bristol Bay in the southwest interior, but nothing too strong. Same thing for Cook Inlet. Kodiak Island, kind of windy, definitely wet for the Alaska Peninsula out to the Pribilofs again, and gusty north winds to 50 miles an hour in the central Aleutians. Otherwise, another warm front there pushes more rain gradually shifting northward there, possibly as far north as Sitka over to Petersburg. Areas south of there will see periods of rain, fog, and drizzle in the afternoon. Should stay dry to the north with mostly clear skies for the North Gulf Coast. And basically dry now for the Arctic coast up there with light winds as that area of snow pulls back to the north. Still kind of grazing the central Arctic coast, but whatever falls there will be nothing more than flurries. Otherwise, for the first day of the weekend, Saturday, cold high pressure over the North Slope and Arctic coast and increasing winds over the north central interior. That frontal system and low pressure area with the lows pushing up toward the Alaska Peninsula. Southerly flow increases now and southeast flow into southern Alaska, bringing milder temperatures and some moisture in. Initially in the form of snow, becoming mixed rain and snow along the North Gulf Coast, area of snow pushing back across the Copper River Basin and on up into the eastern interior again to possibly north of Eagle. And rain with that warm front pushes northward, so temperatures be on the upswing over the southern Panhandle with drying conditions, maybe some sunshine with moderate to briefly heavy amounts of rain possible again for the eastern North Gulf Coast and the extreme north coast of the Panhandle. Otherwise pretty dry with north winds from the St. Lawrence Island area all the way down, picking up a few showers there over the Aleutians, but just scattered showers. And for lows for tonight, near 50 over the southern Panhandle, near 40 in the northern areas, upper 30s for the eastern North Gulf Coast, and anywhere from 5 above to 5 below in the Copper River Basin. Teens and lower 20s for the Kuskokwim Valley, and upper 20s and lower 30s for Bristol Bay, upper 30s Kodiak Island. Otherwise, 10 to 15 in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, and upper teens to lower 20s over the Kenai Peninsula. Highs for tomorrow, mid to upper 30s for the interior areas, Kuskokwim Valley, although lower 20s for the Copper River Basin, about 34 for Valdez, 44 for Homer, 48 Kodiak, 40s for Bristol Bay, and approaching 60 degrees there for Prince of Wales Island. Otherwise, the northern Panhandle, upper 40s. Lows the following morning, lower teens for the Copper River Basin, 20 to 25 in the Kuskokwim Valley, 30 to 35 for Bristol Bay and the Kenai Peninsula. Warmer temperatures coming in, just a little below freezing for the Saturday morning low for Anchorage, Palmer, Kenai, Soldotna, mid-20s for the Susitna Valley, mid-40s Kodiak Island. Highs for Saturday afternoon. Lower to mid-60s over the southern panhandle, south of that warm front, especially if you get some sunshine. Otherwise, 50s, lower to mid-50s in the north. Mid-20s Copper River Basin. Upper 30s to mid-40s south central Alaska. Mid-30s Kuskokwim Valley. And lower 50s Kodiak Island. Lows, coldest along the Brooks Range there. Otherwise, teens and 20s. Highs for tomorrow. Teens in the Brooks Range, 25 to 32 for the Arctic coast, and in the lower 30s through the Tanana Valley, otherwise upper 20s, mid-30s out to the west there near Norton Sound and the Bering Strait. Lows 5 below to 5 above for the Brooks Range, otherwise mostly in the teens everywhere else up the Arctic coast and the Seward Peninsula. Followed by Saturday afternoon temperatures 30 to 35 there for the interior. Colder over the Brooks Range and in the 20s for the Arctic coast, mid-30s out to the west. And for the southwest coast, lows lower 30s, upper 30s Pribilofs, lower 40s for the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Highs upper 40s to lower 50s for the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians, near 40 for the southwest coast, mid-40s for the Pribilofs, mid-30s the low Saturday morning. And in the lower to mid-40s for the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula area, and then the highs for Saturday afternoon, 45 to 50 across the Aleutians, mid-40s for the Pribilofs.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And flying weather for Friday morning, areas of IFR, northwest interior, Noatak Valley, western Brooks Range, eastern North Slope, and areas of the Arctic coast with marginal VFR into the Kobuk-Koyukuk Valleys, northern Seward Peninsula, and down into the lower Yukon River Valley, but the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, in fact, all of southern into the northeast interior, VFR, into the Gulf of Alaska, Kodiak Island, and the northern panhandle, IFR, Pribilofs, down across central Aleutians to close to Nikolsky and the Alaska Peninsula. And for the afternoon, IFR covering the eastern Aleutians and the south coast of the Alaska Peninsula. Marginal VFR moving up Shelikof Strait and the east side of Kodiak Island. Looks like to about Chiniak, Marmot Bay area, Pasagchak, and the northern Bering Sea becoming marginal. IFR, western central Arctic coast, and a little bit over the western Brooks Range. Interior Alaska, good VFR into Lincoln Glacier Bay, North Gulf Coast. And for Saturday morning, interior Alaska, still good VFR, even down to Nunivak Island. Marginal for the Pribilofs, IFR, southeast Bering Sea, Atka, eastward there across the Alaska Peninsula. Kodiak, Fognak Island, into the Barren Islands, IFR, south coast of the Kenai Peninsula. And the eastern North Gulf Coast, northern Panhandle now, IFR, marginal to the south. And for Saturday afternoon, IFR from just north of Eagle, expanding southward there across the Copper River Basin, Upper Tanana Valley, 40-mile country, down to the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, to maybe Portage, Resurrection Bay, and eastward to Yakutat, marginal for the southeast coast. And IFR, Alaska Peninsula, Unalaska Island, extending up into Kuskokwim Delta, and trying to get into the Kuskokwim Valley there. Marginal VFR along the Arctic coast, North Slope VFR, Brooks Range VFR down to the Yukon River, and actually a little to the south and southeast. Another band of IFR coming into the western Aleutians. Passes, Anatuvik and Adigan. Brooks Range looking good for Friday. VFR on either approach. Lake Clark and Merrill ceilings, visibilities possibly unlimited. Kavu conditions also for rainy. Windy, wide open, north and south entrance, VFR. In fact, all of the Alaska Range looking good. Isabel, Mentasta. VFR flying all the passes actually, Tanita included, as well as Portage, VFR, west and east entrances and through the pass. Chilkoot wide, VFR as well. Moving on to freezing levels. At the surface, up north of St. Lawrence Island, but south of the Bering Strait, 2,000 to 4,000 feet there over the southern Bering Sea, Pribilofs, and quite a gradient still across the southeast coast from 2,000 to 10,000 feet. And at the surface down into Shelikof Strait and the North Gulf Coast, just off the North Gulf Coast or just south of the coast there, and just off the southwest coast. And for icing, kind of an elongated area with isolated moderate rime icing there. And for the eastern Gulf into the Panhandle, freezing level up to 18,000 feet. most likely areas there. Some of that slipping into Fogneck Island, possibly the Barren Islands, but more likely across the Alaska Peninsula to the Pribilofs, and then southwestward to Adak and Atka. And from here going to the jet stream, upper level ridging there over the northern Bering Sea, keeping winds pretty light in the main jet down to the south. About 80 knots is it for the Aleutians out of the northwest. Upper level low south of the eastern Aleutians. A little bit stronger jet there to the west, 100 to 130 knots, and then diminishing to 80 knots and turning more southwesterly from the North Gulf Coast up to the eastern interior. And for 9,000 feet, pretty light and variable under high pressure, mainland Alaska, northern Bering Sea. Aleutians only northerlies 35 knots there, Kiska-Amchitka Island, lighter elsewhere. 40 knots east-southeasterlies right across Togiak Bay, and southwest winds of about 30 to 35 knots into the Panhandle. Northwest, maybe 30 knots to the eastern Arctic coast. 3,000-foot wind flow chart showing high pressure from the Northwest Territories in over northern Alaska and into the Russian Far East and south of the far western Aleutians. Low pressure south of the Alaska Peninsula, gradient between the two, 40 to 50 knot northerlies there across the central Aleutians, 50 knots blowing across Sitkinak Island, light for the interior and Panhandle. Turbulence, considerable moderate chop. Barren Islands, northern Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula, western Aleutians.
La-di-da-di-da, Stargizzles. Trace here looking up for you, and this week we've got a great view of the heavenly G. Any morning this week pre-dawn, you just look east and you're going to see bright, beautiful Mars flying through a huge asterism formed by the brightest stars of numerous constellations. I call it the heavenly G. Start in the middle of the G with red Betelgeuse in Orion. Hop to Aldebaran in Taurus, then back to Orion for the super bright Rigel, then to Sirius in Canis Major, Procyon in Canis Minor, Castor and Pollux in Gemini, and finally Capella in Auriga. Retrace your steps with a line connecting these, and you've drawn a giant letter G in the heavens. Looking at stars is looking back in time, and as the original G, Snoop Dogg said, you've got to go back in time if you want to move forward. Share this asterizzle with me on Twitter if you spot it, and keep looking up.
The beluga whale, also known as the white whale, lives in large groups and are unusual among whales. They have no dorsal fin, large bulbous heads, and they can actually swim backwards. To feed, they produce sound to find and hunt fish and invertebrates, and they use sound to communicate.
They're also known as the canaries of the sea because they make such a diversity of noises. They make chirps and whistles and gurgles and trumpeting sounds. They just make all kinds of sounds.
In the U.S., beluga whales live in the cold waters of Alaska, and there are 5 separate populations. Of those 5, the Cook Inlet population is the smallest, and has declined by about 75%. Subsistence hunting may have contributed to this initial population drop, but this practice was regulated starting in 1999, with the last hunt in 2005. Still, the beluga population here has yet to recover.
We listed Cook Inlet beluga whales as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act in 2008, and we had hoped that the population would start recovering, but we are still seeing a continued decline. And these beluga whales are only found in Cook Inlet, and so if they go extinct, we don't think any other belugas will come back and populate this area.
These whales spend most of their summer near Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, where threats to belugas are on the rise as the city grows. These may include diminishing food, habitat loss or destruction, pollution, toxins, and human-caused noise which hampers their ability to feed and communicate. Researchers are trying to understand which of these threats may be impacting them most, but Cook Inlet is a tough place to work.
It's really hostile for research. We have the strong tides, which makes it challenging for human safety, and we can't see through the water. It is very muddy, so we're pretty much limited to the part of the animal that breaks the surface of the water. And as a result, we have limited information about the specific population dynamics of Cook Inlet beluga whales.
Up until recently, Information has mainly come from annual aerial surveys from aircraft and boat or shore-based photo identification surveys that use unique markings to tell animals apart. Scientists also use passive acoustics to listen for belugas, but none of these methods can detect much information about their health.
So it's really been a game changer with the whole species in the spotlight designation. We've gotten more resources within our agency.
For instance, we're able to use a drone to collect some aerial imagery of belugas in the wild, and we're hoping to learn some information about the age classes, information about the health status.
And probably the most important bit of information that we'll get out of that is we'll be able to identify the new calves. And we're hoping if we keep doing this every year, we'll be able to get an estimate of calf production every year that will tell us something about how well the population's doing.
We are also expanding upon our biopsy studies, hopefully to give us some information about sex, the individual's reproductive status, some genetic information, some contaminant loads.
Public and private partners are contributing as well. Some are looking at toxin levels in the whale's prey, while others are analyzing beluga teeth to learn about their age and past diet. Others monitor water quality and how belugas react to boats, and more check to see if their behavior changes with increased background noise. All of these findings will go toward developing effective recovery strategies for this population.
As for what you can do, if you're out boating, give belugas space. Don't drive right up next to them. Stay about 100 yards away. If you're flying over them, just remember that you're putting noise into the water as well, and so stay at least 1,500 feet above them. Report a stranded beluga whale as soon as possible, and that's if they're dead stranded or live stranded. The amount of information that we can learn from these animals by responding to a stranding is monumental, and it will help our efforts to recover them.
Together we can help beluga whales thrive in the dynamic waters of Cook Inlet. With continued research and good stewardship, we hope to see this population grow in the years to come.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, looking at today's sea ice analysis, gradually growing ice along the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast to some extent, and then the pack ice, the main pack ice, or the multi-year ice, now coming south of the label there toward Mackenzie Bay. And onto the coastal water forecasts. For the south coast, southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, small craft advisories along the north coast, east-southeast winds 25 knots, Lynn Canal, north winds 20 knots with higher gusts, and north 15 for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, looking at a southeast wind Friday at 15 knots. And for Saturday, central southern interchannels, small craft advisories, south winds 25 knots, Lynn Canal, southeast at 20, small craft advisories for the entire coast, south winds 30 knots, seas 11 to 16 feet. Prince William Sound, northeast winds at 15 knots, seas 3 feet. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast, where winds will be east 25 to 30 knots. 30-knot east winds also in the forecast for the Barren Islands Friday, and gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, northeast winds 30 knots. And small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 30 knots. And then for Saturday, Cook Inlet, gale warnings, northeast winds 35 knots, strongest winds south of the Forelands, and northeast 35 knots for Kamishak Bay. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, east winds 40 knots, and east-southeast winds 30 to 35 knots for the North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, winds will be northeast at 20 knots. Kodiak Island, gale warnings in Shelikof Strait, otherwise east winds 30 knots. East winds 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, 9 to 14 foot seas, and east winds for Bristol Bay at 30 knots with 7 foot seas. And for the Saturday outlook, gale warnings for northeast winds of 40 knots for Shelikof Strait, otherwise east side of Kodiak Island to Castle Cape will be southeast at 20 knots. Alaska Peninsula, north winds 25 to 30 knots. Bristol Bay, northeast winds at 30 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, northeast winds 15 to 25 knots on Friday. Gale warnings for the central Aleutians, north to northwest winds 35 knots. Western Aleutians, north winds at 25 knots. And for Saturday, western Aleutians, west winds 20 to 25 knots. Central Aleutians, west winds at 30 knots with 12-foot seas. And the eastern Aleutians will be looking at a west to northwest wind at 25 to 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, small craft advisories, east-northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands, northeast winds at 35 knots with 14-foot seas. St. Matthew Island, northeast winds 25 knots with 10-foot seas. St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, winds will be east at 20 knots. And for the day Saturday, Norton Sound, northeast winds at 30 knots, otherwise St. Lawrence Island, northeast at 25. Small craft advisories for the southwest coast for north winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, same thing, north winds 25 to 30 knots, seas at around 10 feet. Up along the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, small craft advisories, west winds 25 knots, central coast, west winds at 20 knots. Western Arctic coast, southwest winds 15 knots, and from Wales to Cape Thompson, winds will be south at 10 knots. And for the day Saturday, Wales to Cape Thompson, east winds at 20 knots, western and central Arctic coast looking at southerly winds of 15 knots, and the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, winds will be southwest at 10 knots, with seas running 3 to 5 feet. And for tonight again, snow tapering off and pulling northward, but still some flurries and fog, a couple of weak troughs along the central and eastern Arctic coast, otherwise dry with light winds over much of interior Alaska with mostly clear skies over a fair area. That'll result in some pretty chilly overnight lows tonight. Wind and rain, Alaska Peninsula and Pribilof Islands, as well as the central Aleutians. Dries out over the Panhandle, some clearing in the north there with high pressure over the Yukon. Otherwise, chance of rain, fog, and drizzle start to increase later tonight over the southern areas again, and that will continue to edge northward throughout the day on Friday there as that warm front pushes northward. Rain comes back into Kodiak Island, stays wet and breezy over the Alaska Peninsula Pribilof, showers and gusty winds over the central Aleutians. And for Saturday, first day of the weekend, just some showers with north winds 15 to 30 miles an hour across the Aleutians. Dry over the Bering Sea, dry and cold over the northern half of the state. Snow moving into the southeast interior, even north of the Alaska Range there, with rain and snow, milder temperatures pushing into southern Alaska, rain in the northern Panhandle.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.